Part 9. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 81. When Zhang Zilu stood up, the eyes of several tables around him were attracted to him. The place, which was originally a little noisy with people talking to each other, also became a little quiet. There was no movement here from farther away, but they also noticed something unusual and asked the table one after another. Although Chengguo officials were dissatisfied with Zhang Zilu's rash behavior, they couldn't say anything more now that the matter had come to this. Mr. Li looked at him and asked, "I wonder what the first couplet is. When I was reading the book of songs a few days ago, I came across the sentence, 'The phoenix is singing on that high hill, the phoenix trees are growing and the sun is rising there.'" Zhang Zilu looked at him and said with a smile, "The phoenix does not live in the parasol tree." When I saw this, something suddenly clicked in my heart. Mr. Li, please listen carefully. There was a thoughtful look on his face. He cleared his throat and said, "My first couplet is, Feng luo wu tong luo feng dot." As soon as Zhang Zilu said the first couplet, it was quickly passed from the adjacent tables to the back. Ling Zhouzi, who was present, began to think subconsciously after hearing the first couplet. This is not a simple couplet, this is a palindrome pair. The so-called palindrome pair means that whether the couplets are read forward or backward, they are the same couplet. In addition to expressing the common artistic conception, the second couplet must also be a palindrome pair. If these points are added together, it is not so right. At the table near the front, someone looked at Su Qingyang and asked, "Qingyang, you are good at couplets, how about this couplet?" "It's hard to say." Su Qingyang shook his head and said, "Although it is difficult to reply to the literary and art circles, it is not absolute. It also depends on Mr. Xiao Li." The man asked again, "Have you come out yet?" Su Qingyang nodded and said, "Only one of them came out." As soon as these words came out, everyone looked at Master Xiao Li and suddenly became nervous. This is not the usual competition of poems and essays, this is a competition between the scholars of Chu and Chen. If his couplets had not stumped each other, not only Zhang Zilu would have lost face, but also the Ling Zhouzi present. Chengguo officials, even Chengguo's face. Zhang Zilu looked at Mr. Li and saw that his expression was calm and showed no trace of embarrassment. His originally peaceful heart suddenly became tense. Soon he calmed down again. The difficulty in writing the palindrome was the palindrome. He thought for a long time but could not come up with a suitable second link. He also did not believe that the other party could come up with a second link in such a short period of time. When he thought of this, Master Xiao Li's voice could already be heard in his ears. "The phoenix falls on the phoenix tree, and the phoenix falls on the phoenix tree, and the pearls and the jade are joined together." The handsome young man thought for a while, and then said, "The mountains are connected to the water, the moon and the water are connected to the mountains, the boat follows the waves, the wind sways the catkins and willows. It's disrespectful to come and go without reciprocating." Mr. Xiao Li looked at him and said, "Not long ago, I occasionally wrote a couplet. I thought hard for many days and couldn't finish it. Those here today are all the best students from Lingzhou. Why don't you just listen to my couplet?" Not only did the opponent play his first couplet, but he also played four of them at once. Zhang Zilu's voice was trembling a little as he said, You said. My first couplet is, 3 lights, sun, moon, and stars." Mr. Xiao Li looked at him, then looked back at the people behind him, and said with cupped hands, "I hope all the heroes of Lingzhou here will give me some advice." 3 lights, sun, moon, and stars," Zhang Zilu murmured, standing there in a daze, his face gradually turning pale. The people around him were all dumbfounded and shocked. While they were still thinking hard, the young envoy from Chu State had already made the second couplet, and there were 4 in a pair. Although palindrome pairs are not absolute for eternity, it is still a bit unbelievable that there are 4 pairs in such a short period of time. Their eyes looked at Zhang Zilu. Could this person named Zhang be an undercover agent sent by the Chu State? Three lights, sun, moon, and stars. Mr. Li's first couplet seems simple, but when you think about it carefully, it makes people feel chills on their backs. The numerals in the couplet must be corrected with numerals. If the word three is used in the first line, it should not be repeated in the second line. There are only 3 words under 3 lights, so no matter which number is used to match, the number of words following it is either more than 3 or less than 3. In other words, the number of words in this couplet does not match at all. Lingzhou Zhu racked his brains, and the dissatisfaction among the local officials in Lingzhou, including Dong governor, had reached the extreme. Wouldn't it be better to eat in peace? Zheng Zilu has to jump out and embarrass these Chu envoys. Now it's okay. If he can't do it, he will be defeated by an army. This time, the Lingzhou officials and students will be embarrassed. Big. The person next to Su Qingyang looked at him and asked, "Qingyang, how are you? Have you figured it out?" Su Qingyang shook his head and said helplessly, "This pairing is really too weird, I can't deal with it." The man looked at Zhang Yanzheng again and asked, "Yanzheng, where are you?" 3 lights, sun, moon, and stars. Zhang Yanzheng rubbed his eyebrows and said angrily, "It's impossible for the number of words to match. How can anyone be right? The person who came up with this pairing must be sick." This couplet has been circulated to all the people. Everyone was thinking hard and racking their brains. The atmosphere in the hall was strangely quiet. When the servants and entourage who came in to serve the food saw this, their hearts skipped a beat and their movements immediately became cautious. "No, no, no," someone shook his head and said, "it's impossible for this pair to fight against each other." Not necessarily. The other person looked forward and said depressedly, "Where is Tang Jiwen? Where has he gone? He may have something to do." Someone shook his head and said, "Tang Jiwen is Jiwen, not a god. Even if a god comes to this couplet, he will not be able to deal with it." Even so, everyone's eyes couldn't help but look at the empty space in front of them. Even Su Qingyang, who was good at couplets, couldn't figure it out. If anyone could figure out this couplet at the Lu Ming banquet today, it would be Tang Jiwen. Although many people still dislike him, they cannot deny this fact. One person raised his head and asked anxiously, "Where did Tang Jiwen go?" Countless eyes looked forward, with anxious expressions on their faces. In the kitchen, Tang Ning looked down at Fang Xiaopang and asked, "Are you full?" Fang Xiaopang threw another piece of venison into his mouth, wiped his mouth and said, "Not yet. Let's eat after we go back." Tang Ning shook her head and led her out of the kitchen. Although he didn't want to go back to a place where not many people wanted to see him, today was the Dear Ming banquet. "I'm sorry to be with Fang Xiaopang." We hid in the kitchen and ate together. The food had been served for a while, and they were probably enjoying the meal now. Tang Ning and Fang Xiaopang walked to the side door, preparing to sneak in during the chaos. When he walked in through the side door, he noticed something was wrong. The originally noisy hall fell silent instantly after they walked in. Then, Tang Ning noticed that everyone was looking at her. How does it feel to be looked at by more than 200 people at the same time? Fang Xiaopang trembled in fright, and took out an apple, 2 pears, and a chicken leg wrapped in paper from his sleeve. She clutched Tang Ning's sleeve tightly, her face turning pale. Tang Ning hesitated at this moment, not knowing whether to walk in or exit. After only a moment's hesitation, he led Fang Xiaopang in and sat back down in his seat. He didn't steal or rob, and he wasn't going out to do anything shameful. There was nothing to hide from. When Mr. Li looked over, he was slightly startled and whispered, "It turns out it's him." When Su Qingyang saw Tang Ning, his eyes lit up and he hurriedly asked, "Is brother Tang good at couplets?" "Couplet?" Tang Ning was stunned and said casually, "I understand a little bit." "Brother Tang, please listen to this couplet." Su Qingyang looked at him and said, "3 lights, sun, moon, and stars, how should we respond to this couplet?" Three lights, sun, moon, and stars. Tang Ning looked at him in surprise and said, a gust of wind and thunderstorm, 2 dynasties of brothers, 4 elegant poems, 5 dynasties of Qin, Jin, and Han. How about it, is it enough? Snap. Su Qingyang stood stunned on the spot. At several tables around him, chopsticks fell to the ground. Tang Ning felt a little strange. This couplet was written by the Liao envoy to test sushi. It was very famous. Su Qingyang didn't know about it, right? After thinking about it for a while, the curiosity in my heart was relieved. The Liao kingdom in this world is not the Liao kingdom in another world. The Liao kingdom in this world was destroyed before it could become powerful or send envoys to embarrass sushi. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 82. 3 lights of the sun, moon, and stars, 4 elegant poems, wonderful, wonderful. Next to Fang Hong, another examiner named Wang Bo stroked his beard and said with a smile, you are such a quick thinker, you are worthy of being Mr. Xiaoyuan Gong. The book of songs is divided into Fen, Ya, and Song in terms of content. The Ya in it is further divided into Dia and Xiaoa, which add up to exactly 4. The 4 poems are for the 3 lights, and the Fenja ode is for the sun, moon, and stars, which couldn't be more appropriate. Although a gust of wind and thunderstorm, brothers of the 2 dynasties, and 5 dynasties of Qin, Jin, and Han are not as appropriate as 4 poems on elegance in terms of content and artistic conception, no matter how you say it, they are all correct. The envoys of Chu state fought 4 against 1, and Tang Jiyuan also fought 4 against 1. In this confrontation, Chen state and Chu state were equally matched. Everyone present silently picked up their chopsticks and looked at Tang Ning involuntarily. How many people thought hard and racked their brains but still couldn't come up with a second line, but he came up with 4 in an instant. Sure enough, only monsters are monsters' opponents. This is a confrontation between monsters, and mortals like them can just watch. Is this Tang Jiyuan? Mr. Li stood up from the table, walked over with a wine glass, and said, I have admired the name Tang Jiyuan for a long time. When I saw him today, he is indeed worthy of his reputation. I admire him and I would like to propose a toast to Tang Jiyuan. After saying that, he picked up the glass of wine. When the person opposite stood up, Tang Ning felt a little familiar, but there seemed to be something different about him. He soon remembered that the reason why he was familiar with her was because he and Tang Yaoyao had seen this person on the street 2 days ago. At that time, she was sitting in a carriage, and he and Tang Yaoyao were holding the carriage while they were vomiting. The reason why he didn't recognize her immediately was because she was different today from 2 days ago. Tang Ning looked her up and down and whispered in surprise, wrapped up. Puff. Mr. Li squirted out a glass of wine before he drank it. Tang Ning wiped her face and stared at her. A look of embarrassment flashed across Master Xiao Li's face, and the envoy from Chu State stood up worriedly and asked, Master Xiao Li, are you okay? It's okay. The look of shame on Mr. Li's face disappeared. He looked at the officials in Lingzhou and said apologetically, I'm really sorry. I choked a lot just now. It's okay, it's okay. Governor Dong stood up awkwardly, looked at Tang Ning, and said, Tang Jiyuan, go wash your face quickly. When Tang Ning came back from washing her face, the atmosphere in the hall had returned to normal. He walked to his seat and sat down. A person next to him cupped his hand and whispered, thanks to Tang Jiyuan just now. If not, we in Lingzhou would be very embarrassed. Not only was Tang Ning sprayed with alcohol, she was also confused. She looked at Su Qingyang and asked, Brother Qingyang, what is going on? Who are they? Su Qingyang told him what had just happened. Tang Ning was slightly surprised. It turned out that the cross-dressing woman they met 2 days ago was actually an envoy from the Chu state. The envoy from the Chu state came to Chen state's Lumming banquet. What to do? He couldn't help but glance at Zheng Zilu opposite. Don't take the porcelain job if you don't have diamonds. Don't pretend to be cool if you don't have real skills. Isn't this just asking for a slap in the face? After the small episode just now, the atmosphere at the banquet became lively. Ling Jojo's present breathed a sigh of relief. The table mates were chatting with each other, and some of them chatted with each other. After the looming banquet officially started, there were no more rules. You could move around the hall as you pleased, and the disciples were not restricted by the previous restrictions. Several people at Tang Ning's table were talking about the couplet just now. Brother Tang is really talented. He is so absolute that he can think of 4 countermeasures. I think 4 poems on elegance is the best. Although a gust of wind and thunderstorm is also right, it always lacks a bit of artistic conception. 5 dynasties, Qin, Jin, and Han, how could they be so right? After everyone discussed this, they felt a little thirsty and hungry. When they picked up their chopsticks and prepared to enjoy the feast, they looked at the table and couldn't help but be startled. Where's the food? Zhang Yanshen's chopsticks were already halfway extended, staring at the empty plate on the table in a daze. Fang Xiaopang rubbed his round belly, leaned lazily on Tang Ning's shoulder, and said with satisfaction, I'm finally full. Are you full so quickly? Tang Ning looked at her and said, there are still a few dishes that have not been served. Woolen cloth. Fang Xiaopang frowned and asked, how many more are there? Tang Ning knew that for Fatty Fang, it was one of the great tragedies in life that she could no longer eat the delicious food. She looked at her and held out 5 fingers. 5 ways. Fang Xiaopang breathed a sigh of relief, he could still eat the 5-course meal. Tang Ning counted the plates on the table and said, 50. There are many dishes at Lu Ming Feast, with more than 50 dishes, but the portion is very small, basically just a few chopsticks per person. In the most original Michelin style, it is not too much to eat and waste. When they were in the kitchen just now, Fang Xiaopang ate more than a dozen dishes. Tang Ning noticed that the kitchen manager was a little panicked. Perhaps this was the reason why each person could only hold 1 chopstick for the dozen or so dishes that had just been served. 50 more. Fang Xiaopang looked at Tang Ning blankly, his rosy face instantly turning pale. A figure walked up to Tang Ning, cupped his hands and said, Tang Jiwen, I'm really sorry for what happened just now. I'll punish you with a drink. When Tang Ning saw that Mr. Li, who was disguised as a man, was still holding a wine glass, she subconsciously stretched out her hands to cover her face. Fortunately, she didn't spit out the drink this time, so Tang Ning could only return the favor, showing that she didn't care. He didn't know why the other party wanted to dress up as a man, but it wasn't easy to expose it in person. After all, he had no enmity with the other party. Don't embarrass others, and don't embarrass yourself. Having received more than 10 years of higher education, he does not discriminate against transvestites. Mr. Li had no intention of leaving. He looked at Tang Ning and asked, is Tang Jiwen good at couplets? Tang Ning shook her head, I just understand a little bit. Tang Jiwen is so humble. He can easily express such absolutes. If he only understands it a little bit, no one in the world would dare to explain it. Master Xiao Li shook his head and said, there is still a link in my heart that has been bothering me for a long time. I have never corrected the second couplet. I wonder if Tang Jiwen can correct it. I'm sorry, Tang Ning said simply. He came here to eat, not to date. If he really hadn't heard of it, wouldn't he be as embarrassed as Zheng Zilu? Master Xiao Li didn't expect that he would respond like this. He looked at him in surprise and said, Tang Jiwen might as well listen. I won't listen. Tang Ning refused more simply. He is a family man and tries to avoid talking to strange women when he is away from home, so that he can be worthy of Xiru and Xiaoi. Su Qingyang and Zhang Yanzhong lowered their heads and stopped looking at him, and the people at the same table also looked away. If it weren't for him being Tang Ning and the state examiner Jiwen, if this wasn't at the Luming banquet, they would have left the banquet long ago. This is cowardice and not fighting. What about a scholar's backbone and integrity? It's embarrassing to sit with him. Mr. Xiaoli looked at him and said at the beginning, Tang Jiwen, listen up, my first couplet is scholar, farmer, industry, and commerce Jiaoyu. Su Qingyang and the others had been listening, and immediately fell into deep thought after hearing the words. This first couplet may seem unrelated, but it has its own mystery. Scholars, farmers, industry, and commerce, palace merchants and Yu. There are 4 karma in the front and 5 tones in the back. One word is repeated and one word is homophonic. They glanced at Master Xiaoli, where did this person's absolutes come from? Tang Ning finally understood that besides liking cross-dressing, this woman also couldn't understand what others were saying. He thought for a while, looked at her and said, scholars, farmers, industrialists, and merchants are both respectful and thrifty. Cold, hot, and warm are the 4 qi, and the 5 virtues of a gentleman are gentleness, kindness, respect, thrift, and thrift. They are also repeated one word and have a homophonic sound. Although the order of the 2 words is reversed, they are still correct. So fast. Su Qingyang and others couldn't help but glance at Tang Ning and sighed inwardly. They had just understood the first couplet, and before they had time to think about it, his second couplet had already come out. Master Xiaoli was startled and looked at him again. Tang Ning saw that Mr. Li was still talking, as if he wanted to write another couplet, so she immediately waved her hand and said, I happen to have a couplet here, and I want to ask Mr. Li for advice. Master Xiaoli looked at him and said simply, Tang Jiwen just says it doesn't matter. This woman likes to test people so much. If she wants to be quiet, she has to gag her. Tang Ning thought for a while and said, my first couplet is ride a strange horse, draw a long bow, and shoot hard rocks with a strong bow. Although the bow is strong, the rocks are even harder. If it weren't for Li Guang, it would be difficult for him to have no feathers. Some people at the same table looked at Tang Ning in surprise. They really couldn't figure out why he came up with such a simple pair. Even they themselves thought of the second line in a short time. When I couldn't help but want to ask questions, I realized that there was something wrong with the expressions of Su Qingyang and Zhang Yan's Hung. Their brows were furrowed, as if they were thinking hard. Mr. Li also seemed to have encountered a problem, his brows furrowed slightly. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 83. The world was finally quiet. The servants had already removed the empty plates from the first round and replaced them with new dishes. Tang Ning picked up the chopsticks and began to enjoy the food alone under the envious eyes of Fang Xiaopang. Riding a strange horse, drawing a long bow, shooting a strong bow at a hard stone, the bow is strong, but the stone is harder. If it weren't for Li Guang, it would be difficult to have feathers. This was a couplet he had seen on Zhe before. This is a couplet that was split into 2 characters. Riding a strange horse means riding, and drawing a long bow means drawing. The bow is strong, but the stone is harder. But this couplet is not just a simple split of characters, it also contains the illusion of the flying general Li Guang shooting a tiger late at night. Splitting characters is easy, but if you split the characters well and match them with a well-known illusion, it is not so easy. This is not an eternal absolute, but it takes time to be clever and clever. As the saying goes, one woman is equal to 500 ducks. Tang Ning did not want to test this little Li, and he didn't care whether she was right or not. He just wanted to shut up these 500 ducks. Someone had already spread the first line of the couplet, and the atmosphere around Tang Ning began to become quiet. This silence gradually spread, and the noisy lumming feast became silent in a very short time. Fang Xiaopang looked at Tang Ning with envy. She could not eat any more. Everyone at the table was thinking. Tang Ning felt embarrassed to eat alone for a long time, so she put down her chopsticks. Fang Xiaopang tugged at his sleeve and said, "You eat?" Tang Ning shook her head and said, "I'm full." Fang Xiaopang looked at him and said, "I'll watch you eat." Tang Ning was a little worried. Although she looked cute when she was fat, it was not a good idea to keep getting fat like this. Overeating would cause problems sooner or later. We should find a way to make her restrain herself. Whether she can get married in the future is another matter. Even if she can't lose weight, she should not continue to get fat. Fang Hong and the local officials of Lingzhou looked at this side, and their mood was a little indescribable. It was not good that the Lumming banquet was messed up like this. They might have the upper hand in the contest with the Chu envoys, and they would also be proud. I can't match this couplet. In a short time after thinking for a while, Master Li simply gave up. He admitted defeat so simply that the Lingzhou students breathed a sigh of relief. If they were really defeated by the Chu people at the Lumming banquet, they would bear an indelible shame. Chu defeated hundreds of Lingzhou students with one person and won a great victory. I don't know how they will publicize it. If you don't know, you really think that there is no one in Lingzhou. After this incident, when everyone looked at Tang Ning again, they had less complaints about him in their hearts. Especially Zheng Zilu, looking at Tang Ning, his eyes were full of gratitude. Tang Ning was a little disappointed. Why didn't this person know how to persist? It seemed that another 500 ducks appeared in front of him. I didn't expect that Tang Jiwen is not only good at poetry, but also good at couplets. Lord Li looked at him and asked, "Not only that, I heard that Tang Jiwen is also very proficient in policy essays. If there is a chance, I would like to ask Tang Jiwen for advice." When talking about policy essays, the eyes of the Lingzhou candidates in the field looked at Tang Ning with some resentment. Tang Ning didn't know what hatred this Chu envoy had with him. He just made a couplet to embarrass him, and now he cleverly attracted a wave of hatred for him. Tang Ning shook his head and said, "Policy essays, I really don't understand it." And, Lord Li may have found the wrong person. He almost said the word girl. Lord Li's face changed slightly. Seeing that he didn't say anything, he quickly regained his composure, looked at him, and said, "In this case, I am presumptuous." After she finished speaking, she walked back again. Seeing that the atmosphere around him became a little strange, Su Qingyang changed the subject and said, "Brother Tang ranked first in the double list. The two poems in the second round are naturally very well written. We have been curious about them for a long time. I wonder if Brother Tang can take out the two poems and let us take a look." There was no grudge between Tang Ning and Su Qingyang, but he was actually talking about something that was not related to him and went against him. He had to copy the poem Bodhisattva Man. The examiner of the state examination could not disclose the content of the examination paper at will. If everyone knew that he wrote, "I am too lazy to draw my eyebrows, and I am late to put on makeup and wash my hair," and newly embroidered silk blouse, with two golden partridges, where would his face as Tang Jiwen be? It's just a humble work. I won't take it out to make everyone laugh. Tang Ning waved his hand and said, "Eat, eat." Just then, he saw the examiner named Wang Bo wave to him. He stood up with some doubts and walked over. "Tang Jiwen, sit here." Wang Bo pointed to the empty seat next to him that was vacated by an official and said, "Mr. Zhang and Mr. Song still have some questions about your third policy essay, and they need to discuss it with you in detail." Mr. Li lowered his head and looked slightly narrowed. Tang Ning looked around and saw that the seating arrangement at this table had obviously been adjusted. He knew the two examiners, Fang Hong and Wang Bo. He naturally knew Song Qian and Ling Yuheng. There was another person he didn't know, who should be Zhang Hao, the doctor of the Ministry of Water Resources. As for the other two, one was Mr. Li just now, and the other should also be an envoy of the state of Chu. Although he and Mr. Li were not seated together, they were adjacent. Wang Bo did not get into the topic, but looked at him and said, "Your poem and lyrics are rare masterpieces even if they are taken to the provincial examination. Scholars should be modest, but not too modest." Tang Ning nodded to show that he was learning. "If you come to Beijing in the future, if there is a chance, I can introduce you to Prime Minister Wang." Wang Bo looked at him and said, "Prime Minister Wang was good at Huajian Ci when he was young, so he should be able to give you some pointers." "Tang Jiwen is also good at Huajian Ci." The Chu envoy looked at him in surprise and said with a smile, "If this is the case, Tang Jiwen and Mr. Xiao Li can discuss it more." The Huajian Ci written by Jiwen of the Tang dynasty has a strong legacy of Shu. If there were no examination papers to prove it, we would even think that it was really written by a great poet of the Huajian school hundreds of years ago. Wang Bo naturally he did not hesitate to praise the talents of Chen state in front of the envoys of Chu state, smiled and said, "Master Xiao Li, please listen to this song Bodhisattva Man, which was written by Tang Jiwen in the state examination hall." Tang Ning was stunned and said hurriedly, "Master Wang." Mr. Wang waved his hand and said, "Don't worry, you are very accurate in understanding a woman's relationship. Even if Wang Cheng is on a blind date, you can't find any flaws." Tang Ning looked at him blankly. "What do you mean by the fact that he has an extremely accurate grasp of a woman's affection? When has he ever figured out a woman's affection? This is tainting someone's innocence for no reason." Wang Bo had already smiled and recited, "The hills overlap and the gold shines, and the clouds on the temples want to touch the fragrant snow on the cheeks." Mr. Li listened to a few words, and when he looked at him, his eyes were slightly strange. Everyone deliberately kept quiet, and the people around them could hear clearly. Su Qingyang thought for a long time and then said, "If this poem is said to be written by Miss Zhong, I have no doubt at all." Zhang Yanzhong was surprised and said, "I didn't expect that Brother Tang's thoughts are so delicate. I'm afraid even many women are far behind." The surrounding students also expressed surprise. Although they didn't like Tang Jiwen very much, they didn't deny that he had the courage to give direct advice regardless of his own future, and he was considered to be a man of iron bones. But now, in their hearts, the iron-clad Tang Jiwen pinched an orchid finger playfully, leaned on the bed, and drew his eyebrows lazily. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 84. Feeling the looks from around her, Tang Ning's biggest regret in a short period of time was that she didn't memorize Bodhisattva Man a few more times in her previous life. The Chu envoy looked at Mr. Li and asked, "Sir Xiao Li, what do you think of this poem Between Flowers by Tang Jiwen? The whole body is composed of one breath, there is no stray word, and the topic of dressing up has been written in countless layers. It is really a unique pen." Mr. Xiao Li looked at Tang Ning and said, "I didn't expect that Tang Jiwen, as a man, could be so profound. I admire the way it depicts a woman's love." Tang Ning looked at her and smiled, both each other. Mr. Xiao Li obviously knew the meaning of his words, so he looked away and said no more. The Chu state envoy smiled and said, "Tang Jiwen and Mr. Xiao Li do not need to be humble. When it comes to Huajian Ci, there are few people in the world who can compare with you." Tang Ning didn't want the Chu envoy to compare him with Mr. Li. She was a woman, and it was normal for her to write a good story about a girl's relationship. There was no comparison at all. Wang Bo disagreed with his words, shook his head and said, "If the envoy thinks that Tang Jiwen only understands women's relationship, he is totally wrong." He smiled and said, "Listen to another poem written by Tang Jiwen on the state examination." After that, he recited the song Lime Song impassionedly. After the Chu envoy heard this, he was a little confused for a moment and was unsure of the source. Did this poem be written on the same day as Tang Jiwen? Wang Bo nodded and said, "That's natural." The envoy of the Chu state looked at him and praised him, able to be both tender and bold. Tang Jiwen is already a master of poetry. This is really normal. Tang Jiwen's wife is known as the most talented woman in Lingzhou. Tang Jiwen understands the separation and hatred between friends, which is nothing more than normal. Wang Bo added another sentence before looking at Zhang Hao, the doctor of the Ministry of Water. Said, Master Zhang, if you have any questions to ask Tang Jiwen about the flood control strategy, you can ask them now. Zhang Hao had already been waiting anxiously. He looked at Tang Ning and was about to speak. He seemed to have remembered something. He looked at Mr. Li and the Chu envoy, picked up the wine glass, and said unhurriedly, Today is a dear. The purpose of the Mingzi banquet is to celebrate Ling Zhu's election. Let's not talk about official matters until after the Mingzi banquet. Wang Bo was a little surprised. With Zhang Hao's temper, he had been anxious for several days. How come he could sit still at this time? When he looked at the Chu envoy, he immediately understood. There are many rivers in Chu state, and their floods are much more serious than that of Chen state. To some extent, Tang Ning's policy already belongs to Chen Kuaji, so it is naturally not convenient to talk about it at this time. In this case, it is not easy for Mr. Song Qiansong to speak at this time. He looked at Ling Yuheng and said with a smile, although Tang Jiwen is knowledgeable, he is still too young and does not understand medical skills. Regarding that epidemic prevention policy, does Mr. Ling have anything else to advise? Ling Yuheng immediately shook his head, no, no. Wang Bo smiled and said, You're welcome, Mr. Ling. There had been no chance just now, but now he found an opening. Ling Yuheng stood up, looked at Tang Ning, bowed slightly and said, Ling Yuheng has met Uncle Master. Uncle Master. Wang Bo stood stunned on the spot. Zhong Mingli had a look of astonishment on his face, and everyone including the envoys of Chu state had shocked expressions on their faces. Although Fang Hong knew that Divine Doctor Sun once said that Tang Ning was his junior brother, it was still hard for him to believe that the imperial physician Cheng Ling Yuheng called him his junior brother in public. Not to mention the identity gap between the two, the age gap alone is really too big. Tang Ning had seen Ling Yuheng a long time ago. The reason why she didn't say hello was because she was afraid that he would show something strange. I have to say that this nephew really respected his teacher. Tang Ning sighed and said, You're welcome, sit down. Seeing that Ling Yuheng had really sat down, Zhong Mingli glanced at Tang Ning. Even the imperial physician Chen was his nephew. I really didn't know what else he was hiding from him besides his abilities. Seeing that Wang Bo and others were still looking at him, Tang Ning explained, Master Ling's master and I have some connections. Wang Bo looked at the two of them, still a little hard to accept. Who is Ling Yuheng's master? He is the famous Dr. Sun, a descendant of medicine king Sun Simiao. The Sun family has inherited medicine for so long and has long become the backbone of medicine. Divine Dr. Sun has disciples all over the world, including countless famous doctors, and there are several who work in Tai Hospital. Tang Ning suddenly became the uncle of these people, and there was a huge power behind him. But he was still like this young. Everyone at the table looked at him strangely. Tang Ning couldn't bear it. She felt that the food in her mouth had no taste, so she found an excuse to leave the table and return to her seat. Fang Xiaopang sat in her seat with a sad and desperate look. She couldn't take a bite anymore and could only watch others eating. Tang Ning couldn't bear to see her like this, so she patted her shoulder and said, How about you close your eyes? Fang Xiaopang obediently closed his eyes. Su Qingyang picked up the chopsticks and put them down again. After repeating this process several times, he finally couldn't help but look at Tang Ning and asked, Brother Tang is really Master Ling's uncle. As Su Qingyang opened his mouth, everyone looked over. The two tables were adjacent to each other, and they heard the conversation between Tang Ning and the officials just now very clearly. Tang Ning shook her head and said, It's a long story. In short, it's not what you think. No matter how long it sounds, his words at least prove one thing, that is, it is true. Tang Jiwen was the uncle of Lingzhou imperial physician Cheng Ling Yuheng. This was a greater shock to them than Tang Ning's examination of Zhongzhou's Jiyuan exam. In order to ensure the fairness of the imperial examination, candidates and examiners must avoid suspicion. If a candidate has a relative or teacher-student relationship with any examiner, he must deliberately avoid it, stagger the exam, or go to other Gongyuan for reference to show fairness. If the examiner is the candidate's nephew, no one knows whether he needs to be avoided, because such a thing has never happened. Su Qingyang felt that his head was a little messed up. This brother Tang, whom they had just met not long ago, always gave them different shocks. There were no secrets at the Lumming banquet. Whether it was the fight with the Chu envoy just now or the conversation at the front table, no matter what happened, it would be passed down by word of mouth until it reached the ears of every candidate. Tang Jiwen single-handedly defeated the envoys of Chu State and saved the face of Lingzhou students and Chen State. No matter how much they hated him before, they still had to accept his request. No one would have the thought of comparing with him. He was destined to be different, whether it was knowledge or conduct, making people respect, hate, and fear him. There is another surprising thing. The imperial Dr. Chen Ling Yuheng is actually his nephew. This seems incredible to them. The other way around is a normal thing. It just happened. Tang Jiwen, who became famous from the first game of the state examination and then got out of control, created miracles again and again, and changed their perception of him again and again. This time the deer roaring banquet was not what Tang Ning had thought before. Although Ling's Huzjizi was not very enthusiastic towards him, his attitude was not that bad either. In other words, this was not a hungmen banquet. There were no twists and turns in the following banquet. The Lumming banquet was completed according to the procedures. Fang Hong took Fang Xiaopang back. Tang Ning said goodbye to Su Qingyang and others and went back with his father-in-law. Along the way, it was natural to explain Ling Yuheng's affairs. I still follow the old rules, and when I encounter something that cannot be explained, I put all the responsibilities on that snowy winter. Late at night. In Lingzhou Post House, several Chu state envoys had just returned from the Lumming banquet. After the middle-aged envoy stepped into a certain courtyard, he let out a long sigh and said, "What a pity." Master Xiao Li looked at him and asked, "What's the pity?" As early as when reviewing the test papers in the third session of the state examination, Zhang Hao, a doctor in the Ministry of Water Resources, accidentally revealed that Tang Jiwen's water control strategy could save Chen Guo at least 500,000 taels of silver. The middle-aged envoy shook his head. He shook his head and said with great regret, "It's a pity that our people can't see that examination paper. If it weren't for the serious floods and heavy expenditure every year, the national strength of our Chu state would have already surpassed that of Chen state. This examination paper, for us, worth far more than $1 million. Master Xiao Li thought for a moment, raised his head, with a smile on his face, and said, "It doesn't matter, let's stay in Lingzhou for a little longer this time, the future is long." Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 85. After the deer crowing banquet, the state examination was completely over. The 240 newly promoted candidates from Lingzhou and 2 neighboring states will take the provincial examination in March next year. Although it is still early, most students will pack their bags and rush to the capital in the next few days. Tang Ning is not in a hurry. The provincial examination will start on March 9. It won't be too late for him to start in February. Lingzhou is not that far from the capital. Half a month is enough. To be on the safe side, leave another half month. Nothing is lost. After all, he is different from most candidates. Although the provincial exam is much more difficult than the state exam, the types of questions will not change. In this way, his problems in the first 2 games are not big. The only problem is strategy for the third game. Even if the policy was to be restructured, it would not be so fast. When it came to the provincial examination, he could no longer rely on his luck like the state examination. Therefore, in the next nearly 6 months, The only thing he had to do was to write the article. Try to write as beautifully as possible. His father-in-law had specifically told him to ask him if he had anything he didn't understand. After thinking about it, Tang Ning decided that it would be better to let Zhongyi teach him how to write articles. After all, Zhongyi is the most talented woman in Lingzhou. Not only can she write poems well, but she can also write colorful articles. As for my father-in-law, he even passed the state examination 3 times. I came back from the Lumming banquet last night and went to Zhongyi's room to sit for a while. At that time, the two of them had agreed that Tang Ning would write a policy essay every day, and Zhongyi would help him review it and correct the grammar. In a few months, even if he still couldn't write as beautiful an article as she did, he wouldn't be able to write it. Being called bullshit. When Tang Yaoyao came to see Zhongyi, she was very surprised by his diligence and asked, "Are you really planning to take the top prize this time?" Tang Ning nodded. Tang Yaoyao thought for a moment and said, "I remember you said before that you didn't want to take part in the imperial examination. Didn't I get hit on the head by you at that time?" Tang Ning looked at her and explained, "What's the difference between a scholar who doesn't want to win the top prize and a salted fish?" After he finished speaking, he thought for a moment, then looked at Zhongyi and asked, "Does what you said that day count?" Zhongyi blushed slightly and nodded. Tang Ning finally felt relieved and continued to write. Scholars who didn't want to win the top prize were just salty fish, and salty fish couldn't get happiness. For his lifelong happiness, he will write 10 articles today and will not sleep until he finishes. When Tang Yaoyao and Zhongyi walked out of the room and walked into the yard, they finally couldn't help but ask, "What did you say?" "Nothing." Zhongyi shook his head and changed the subject. "Did you send the letter I wrote to Miss Jing last time?" "My father asked the steward of the store to deliver it a long time ago." Tang Yaoyao patted his chest and said, "Don't worry, you will receive a reply in a few days." Zhongyi said with some embarrassment, "Sorry for bothering Uncle Tang." "It's no trouble." Tang Yaoyao shook his head and said, "Anyway, they often have to run from Lingzhou to the capital, and they just bring a letter along the way. It's nothing." Zhongyi held her hand and said, "No matter what, thank you. If you really want to thank me, tell me what you said to him." Tang Yaoyao looked at her with a gossipy face and said, "It's impossible for him to suddenly think of taking the number 1 exam. This matter must have something to do with you." "What relationship?" Zhongyi thought for a while, finally made a decision, and whispered something in her ear. Tang Yaoyao's beautiful eyes widened and she looked at her, confused. You are crazy, how can this be?" Zhongyi looked at her without speaking. Tang Yaoyao covered her face, sighed, and then said bitterly, "I'm taking advantage of him." "Okay." Zhongyi tugged on her sleeves and said, "Xiao Ru's shop is almost ready, let's go take a look." Tang Ning was full of motivation when she woke up early in the morning. She originally wanted to write 10 policy papers in one go, but she was interrupted after only 2. It was his father-in-law who interrupted him. "There is also Zhang Hao, the doctor from the Ministry of Water who I met yesterday. They seemed to have something to say last night, but then left it alone. Unexpectedly, they chased them directly to the house today." After Zhang Hao sat down, he said straight to the point, "Tang Jiwen, I still have some questions about controlling floods and speeding up shipping, and I would like to discuss them with Tang Jiwen." Tang Ning cupped her hands and said politely, "It's okay, Mr. Zhang." Zhang Hao cleared his throat and said, "Tang Jiwen mentioned in the policy discussion about the Jingjiang section. The policy paper has a limited number of words, so it is impossible for Tang Ning to expand on every point. The examples given are also concise and to the point. Today, she can expand on it in detail. Of course, he is not a water conservancy major. He can put forward opinions and explain the principles, but it is impossible to get to the root cause." But for the discussion between the two, this was enough. Some modern concepts of water control were a bit unimaginable to the ancients, but they were not fantasy. Zhang Hao frowned for a while, suddenly realized it, and grasped for a while. A few hairs came down, and after a while, he patted his thighs and cheered. While listening, he picked up a pen to take notes. When a piece of paper was filled with his writing, he put down the pen, looked at Tang Ning, and said excitedly, "I thought that Tang Jiwen's policy would save the national treasury at least 500,000 taels of silver, now it seems that it is much more than that." He grabbed Tang Ning's arm and said happily, "When I go back this time, I will definitely report Tang Jiwen's contribution to His Majesty. If Tang Jiwen passes the imperial examination in the future, you may consider my water department. The water department needs talents like Tang Jiwen." Ahem, Zhou Mingli coughed lightly, interrupting Zhang Hao's passion. Zhang Hao glanced at Zhou Mingli, then looked at Tang Ning, and sighed with some regret. The person in front of him was the champion of the Lingzhou state examination, the first person in Lingzhou and Chen state in more than 10 years. Such a person will definitely shine in the provincial examination. If he cannot become the champion, he can also rank first. The Ministry of Works is very far behind in the 6 ministries. It is not as lucrative as the Ministry of Revenue, nor as powerful as the Ministry of Personnel. Even the most useless Ministry of Rights is better than them. As a thankless department in the Ministry of Works, who would be willing to go to a poor government office with no future for the top 2 jinchi? Zhang Hao calmed down and bowed, saying, "On behalf of all the people affected by the disaster, I would like to thank Tang Jiwen." Tang Ning hurriedly said, "This is what I should do." "Sir Zhang, you don't have to do this." He had long heard that Zhang Hao was straightforward and had a bad temper, but when he saw him today, he didn't feel that. Not only did he not have that, but he also didn't have the slightest bit of sophistication. He only had a sincere heart to ask for advice humbly. When Zhang Hao left, Zhou Mingli looked at him and said, "Sir Song had some official business and left Lingzhou early in the morning. Otherwise, he would have come with us today." Tang Ning nodded. Song Qian was not in charge of Lingzhou, but of nearly 10 states along the way to Jingdong. It was impossible for him to stay in Lingzhou for a long time. In addition to him, Fang Hong, Zhang Hao, Ling Yuheng and other examiners would probably set off to return to Beijing in the next 2 days. The Lingzhou state examination has come to a complete end. Officialdom is like a battlefield. It is better to make more friends than more enemies. Zhou Mingli looked at him and said, "Although Lord Zhang has a straightforward temper, he is a person worth making friends with. You have done Lord Fang a favor, and Lord Fang is grateful to you. You should also be self-disciplined and not take advantage of the favor, and Lord Ling, although you are his uncle, he is also the chief physician. If you can meet him again in the future, you must give him face in front of outsiders." Tang Ning nodded, and his father-in-law started nagging again, but his nagging was mostly from the heart and experience, with little nonsense. Zhou Mingli watched Tang Ning walk out of the house, retracted his gaze, and looked into the distance. Everyone knows that many examiners of the Lingzhou provincial examination will set off to return to Beijing today, but few people know that they will also leave with a test paper. This thin test paper is still unknown whether it is a gravel that can't splash a few water splashes or a meteor that can set off a huge wave. Zhou Mingli looked somewhat relieved, but more worried. After a long while, he sighed, put his hands behind his back, and slowly walked back to the mansion. This chapter was first published on AIU Voice Novel Network. Please remember the URL. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 86. The third uncle and the third aunt bought a shop on the main street of Zhoucheng. In addition to selling tofu, they also did breakfast business. Xiru's cloth shop is not far from their breakfast shop. You can see it when you look up. If something happens, you can take care of it. The third uncle's shop has been opened. The location of the store is not bad. Although the third uncle does not agree with Tang Ning's suggestion of a big opening bonus, buy £2 and get £1 free, when he saw the profit on the first day, decided on the spot to extend the opening ceremony for another 2 days. Tang Ning walked over, and her third uncle was talking to the butcher in the shop next door. Next door to their shop was a butcher's shop. The butcher's surname was Zheng. One night, when Butcher Zheng was closing the stall, he gave him 2 tails of leftover pig head meat. The third uncle gave him 2 pieces of unsold tofu in return. And since then, the two have become familiar with each other. When the third uncle saw him, he waved his hand and said, "Xiaoning, Lao Zheng just gave me 3 tails of pork belly. Remember to come over for dumplings in the evening." Tang Ning waved her hand, indicating that she understood. This place is very close to the alley where he woke up. When Tang Ning came over, she bought a few buns and distributed them to the beggars in the alley. The cannibal is soft-spoken and the taker is short-handed. Even a beggar has self-respect. The beggar leader looked at Tang Ning and said apologetically, "Sir, I'm so sorry. We have searched all over Lingzhou city these days, including several people outside the city. I've searched in ruined temples but haven't found the person you're looking for." "Forget it if you can't find it." Tang Ning waved her hand and said, "I have another thing to ask you." "Master, please tell me." Tang Ning pointed to the shop not far away and said, "I want you to help me look at that shop. If anything happens, immediately go to the place I told you last time to find me. Even if you have nothing to do on weekdays, please help me take care of it." The beggar patted his chest and said, "Don't worry, sir, we will always watch and prevent anyone from causing trouble there. The base camp of these beggars is here. Once something happens, they can react faster than themselves and the government officials." Tang Ning took out a few pieces of broken silver from her arms, handed it to him, and said, "Take this money and buy some food for the brothers." "Thank you, sir." The beggar was not polite. After taking the money, he pointed to the shop not far away, turned to look at the beggars, and said, "Open your eyes and watch carefully." Tang Ning handed the matter to the beggars and walked out of the alley. An old beggar was leaning against the corner of the alley, shouting casually, "Do not miss passing through. Shadowless sword, thunder palm, lost track. The only secret book is worth 30 taels of silver each, 12 or 3 copies." There were no new wounds on the old beggar's face. He probably hadn't deceived children recently. Judging from the price he offered, his target of deception had changed from children to adults. When Tang Ning passed by, she asked casually, "Are there the 18 dragon subduing palms?" The old beggar was startled, then shook his head. "Where's the 36th way of beating a dog with a stick?" The old beggar thought for a moment and continued to shake his head. "If you don't even know the 18 dragon subduing palms and the dog beating stick, why are you pretending to be a beggar and selling martial arts secrets?" The so-called secret books he sold to him last time are still cushioned on the corner of the table in his room. However, this time, the few books in front of him don't look so shabby, and the packaging is quite exquisite. It's something a scruffy old beggar can come up with. Tang Ning picked up a book out of curiosity, turned a page, and immediately blushed. The old beggar looked at him with a mysterious smile on his face and asked, "How about it? Is it worth 3 taels of silver?" In an era when there was no internet and no romantic movies from island countries, the erotic pictures in color pages were definitely a unique collection. Not to mention 3 taels of silver, 30 taels was a conscientious price. The old beggar may not be a serious beggar, but he is a conscientious businessman. It's strange that he has such a precious thing, but he is reduced to begging on the street. He shouldn't even think about it. "Brother Xiaoning." At the door of the shop not far away, Su Ryu was already waving to him. Tang Ning hurriedly put down the secret book in her hand, glanced at the old beggar, and walked towards the shop. After Tang Ning left, the old beggar shook his head and said with some regret, "Tisk, tisk, you don't know what to buy. This is the treasure of the palace." When Tang Ning walked over, Su Ryu glanced in the direction of the alley and asked doubtfully, "Brother Xiaoning, what are you doing there?" "I bought a few buns and gave them to the beggars." Tang Ning smiled and asked, "How is the shop?" A smile appeared on Su Ryu's face and she said, "The first batch of goods has arrived. Sister Zhong and Miss Tang are looking inside. The goods in the shop are mainly various fancy fabrics and embroidery, and they also sell small items such as women's purses and fans. These are all collected from villages outside the city. Most of the women from ordinary families are skilled in women's knitting. The things they weave by hand have fine stitches and high quality, and are very popular with customers in the city." Tang Ning asked her third uncle to choose a few smart little girls from Sujia village to take care of the shop and greet customers on weekdays. The store has not officially opened today, so naturally there are no customers. There are only two people in the store, Tang Yao Yao and Zhong Yi. I think this shelf should be placed on the other side. Tang Yao Yao and Zhong Yi were discussing the layout of the store. The Tang family is in business, and their business is very large. Not only are there Tang family stores all over Lingzhou city, but the hands of the rich man Tang have even reached other places such as the capital. As the daughter of a rich man, although Tang Yajing is not very good at math, she has a lot of ideas about doing business and can give Xiru some constructive suggestions. When she spoke, she looked at Zhong Yi, then at Su Ryu, and finally at Tang Ning. Tang Ning couldn't understand the expression on her face. Zhong Yi looked at the door and said, "A customer is coming." Although the store has not officially opened, the goods have been put on the shelves. If there are customers coming in, they will not be turned away. Su Ryu looked at the figure who came in and asked, "Sir, what do you want to see?" Tang Ning looked at the figure who walked into the store and said in surprise, "Why is it you?" Tang Yao Yao looked at the handsome young man, a trace of doubt appeared on her face, and soon remembered something. Looking at the handsome young man's chest, a trace of doubt appeared in her eyes. Little Master Li looked at Tang Ning and smiled, "What a coincidence, I can meet Tang Jiwen here too." Little Master Li is very good at disguising herself as a man. If Tang Ning hadn't seen her incomplete appearance that day, she might not have recognized her right away. Su Ryu looked at them and asked in surprise, "Brother Xiaoning knows this young man?" Tang Ning nodded, looked at Little Master Li, and said, "Little Master Li, we meet again." Su Ryu poured 2 cups of tea, placed them on the table outside, and went back in. Tang Yao Yao looked at Little Master Li with a slightly wary look, pulled Zhong Yi and Su Ryu into the inner room, and whispered something in their ears. The two of them soon became surprised. At the table, Tang Ning took a sip of tea, looked at the young Master Li, and asked, "Your country's envoy, are you not leaving for the capital yet? You can arrive in Beijing before the end of the year, there is no rush." Young Master Li looked at him and said, "Besides, Lingzhou has beautiful scenery and outstanding people. We want to stay here for a while to experience the customs of Lingzhou." Tang Ning always felt that the other party's purpose was not so simple. He didn't believe that meeting her here today was a coincidence. Last night he felt that this young Master Li was very wrong, as if he had some conspiracy, and now this feeling is even stronger. But what does she want from me? He has no money, no power, and the only thing he can offer is, can she be someone who wants from me? Tang Ning looked at her suspiciously and nodded, then stay a little longer. Unfortunately, we are in Lingzhou, unfamiliar with the place, and the only person we know is Tang Jiwen. Lord Li looked at him, changed the subject, and said, "Maybe we have to bother Tang Jiwen more these days." Tang Ning waved his hand and said, "Lord Li, you are joking. If there is anything, the post station and the government will arrange it for you. There is no need for me." "That's right." Lord Li nodded and said, "Tang Jiwen still has to prepare for the provincial exam, so we can't bother him. Although she said so, Tang Ning's heart was still on his mind. Especially when he saw the smile on her face, he vaguely felt that trouble was coming. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 87. Master Li only wet his lips with tea, looked at Tang Ning, and asked, "Does the couplet that Tang Jiwen wrote last night have a second line?" To be honest, no. Tang Ning shook his head. He saw it occasionally on the internet and didn't know the second line. Tang Yao Yao walked out from the inner room and passed by the two of them. Tang Ning knew without looking that her ears must have pricked up. Master Li looked at her, thought about what happened that day, and asked, "Is this Mrs. Tang?" "Pa." Tang Yao Yao looked at her with shame and said, "You are Mrs. Tang." Soon she realized that this sentence was not right, and hurriedly said, "You are not Mrs. Tang either, Mrs. Tang is inside." After saying that, she felt that this explanation was a bit redundant, and walked in angrily again. Master Li looked at him in confusion and asked, "This girl?" "Don't worry about her." Tang Ning waved her hand and asked, "Master Li, you are here for more than just a casual stroll, right?" "Really just a casual stroll." Master Li stood up, looked at a shelf somewhere, picked up a round fan embroidered with lotus flowers, and said, "This fan is very beautiful." Tang Ning looked at her with a slightly teasing look. No matter how much she likes men's clothes, she can't change the fact that she is a woman. Sometimes subconscious actions will reveal her identity. Master Li saw Tang Ning looking at her strangely, and then he remembered that with her current identity, she should not be interested in a woman's round fan. He hurriedly put it down, but then he remembered that his identity had long been unconcealed in his eyes. This kind of behavior of trying to cover up the truth was a bit ridiculous. She simply picked it up generously and asked, "How much is this fan?" Tang Ning waved her hand and said, "Master Li is the first customer of our store. If you like it, I will give it to you." "Then I won't be polite." Master Li picked up the fan again and said, "There are still many things I want to talk to Tang Jiwen about, but I have some chores today, so let's do it another day." "Master Li, take care." Tang Ning stood at the door and watched her walk out. Suddenly, she asked, "If we meet again next time, you can't still call me Master Li or Master Li, right?" Master Li paused and said, "Li Lan." Tang Ning nodded and said, "So this is Miss Li's name." The figure in front of him turned around, thought for a moment, looked at him, and said, "Li Tianlan, Tian of Tianguang, Lan of Bolan." She looked at Tang Ning again and turned away. Li Tianlan, a very domineering name, and also very nice, better than Tang Yao Yao. Lan means big waves, so her name is quite appropriate. However, there is a popular saying among the people that if you lack water, you should make up for it. If the 5 elements lack water, there should be water in the name. At the very least, there should be 3 water radicals. If it is seriously lacking, you should use miao. The same is true for yan, sen, and xin. According to this theory, Tang Yao Yao should change her name to Tang Lanlan. Tang Yao Yao and Zhong Yizhou came out from inside, looked at him and asked, "What did she say to you just now?" Tang Ning explained, "She is an envoy of the state of Chu. We met at the Lumming banquet last night." Tang Yao Yao was surprised and said, "Can a woman be an envoy?" "No." Tang Ning shook his head and said, "So she has to wear men's clothes?" Tang Yao Yao suddenly remembered something and said, "She didn't pay for the fan just now." Tang Ning waved his hand and said, "We are all friends, just give her a fan, don't be so stingy." For some reason, Tang Yao Yao showed obvious dissatisfaction with Li Tianlan. Was it because she had just called her Madam Tang? Her surname was Tang, so it wasn't entirely wrong to call her that, but a good young lady should be angry when she was called Madam. Or was it because Yao is the same as Yao, Yao means small, and Lan means big boobs, and she was jealous that Li Tianlan was older than her in every way? He didn't know the specific reason. After returning to Zhong's house, the first thing Tang Ning did was to take out the thin books that were used as pads on the corners of the table in the room. There were 3 books in total, all of which were tattered, and there was not even a name on the cover. It really is true that you get what you pay for. The color hardcover edition that cost 3 taels of silver was not of the same quality as the tattered one that cost 10 cents. Tang Ning opened the first book and was disappointed as expected. The booklet had a figure drawn with simple lines, without even facial features, and could only barely make out a human figure, which was completely incomparable to the high-definition, uncensored color pictures he saw today. He opened another book, which was also the simplest graphic. Tang Ning didn't have much hope for the last book. He flipped through it casually. It was still the same simple lines. He imitated the drawings on the book and put it on the corner of the table. His journey to becoming a martial arts master was still a long way off. After writing another policy paper, he felt his head was a little swollen. It took time for the ice to freeze 3 feet thick. Tang Ning didn't plan to write 10 articles today. He would take these 3 articles to Zhong Yi's room in the evening and discuss them with her. He came to the yard and began to practice the moves that Tang Yaoyao taught him. According to Tang Yejing, the moves were only the basis. In order to exert the power of the moves, the internal strength must also keep up. Tang Ning couldn't reach that level yet. Tang Yejing said that at least after he took the imperial examination, he would be taught the internal strength method. This body still needs to be strengthened. After practicing twice, he was slightly out of breath and sat on the stone bench to rest. Tang Yaoyao jumped down from the wall and said, "You can't do it after just 2 times. If you are lazy like this, you will never be able to break through yourself." Tang Ning stood up again. He could allow Tang Yejing to say that he was lazy, but he could not allow her to say that he was not good enough. "It's useless for you to practice alone." Tang Yaoyao walked in front of him and said, "Treat me as your enemy. Now, attack me." Tang Ning did not attack Tang Yaoyao, but just looked at her. He was thinking about where he had offended her today. If he attacked her, he would be dead. After all, her long legs were not only beautiful, but also useful. Tang Yaoyao looked at him disdainfully and put one hand behind her back. "I'll give you one hand." Tang Ning glanced at her long legs hidden behind her skirt and shook her head. It was not that he was inferior. Tang Yejing kicked him 10 meters away and couldn't use her hand at all. Tang Yaoyao rolled her eyes at him and said, "You don't need your legs, let alone your internal strength. Just use this one hand." If Tang Ning retreats again without using his internal strength or legs, and he is forced to use one hand, he will have no dignity left as a man. Tang Ning thought for a moment, looked at her and said, "I have another request." Tang Yaoyao glanced at him and said, "Say it." "Don't hit me in the face." As soon as he finished speaking, he raised his hand and grabbed Tang Yaoyao's shoulder. Snap! Tang Yaoyao's body slightly tilted, and her other hand casually slapped his wrist, causing a burning pain in Tang Ning's wrist. Tang Yaoyao didn't look at him and said calmly, "Too slow." Tang Yejing is usually unreliable, but he is always serious about this matter. Tang Ning rubbed his wrist and rushed forward again. "Too slow, full of flaws. Don't look at the attack. Are you worried that your opponent doesn't know your moves? Try harder, you eat so much every day, where is your strength going?" Tang Ning had long been accustomed to Tang Yejing's strictness. He was just a little disappointed. Tang Yejing asked him to use 2 legs and 1 hand, and he didn't use internal force. He was not her opponent. What's the use of what he practiced every day? When he was thinking about this, Tang Yejing slapped his wrist again and said lightly, "At this time, you can still be distracted." Tang Ning hurriedly came back to his senses, and when he looked again, her palm had already slapped his chest. If it was a real fight of life and death, when her hand landed on his chest, Tang Ning would be a dead man. He immediately stretched out his hand to block it, but other pictures flashed in his mind at this moment, and his body stepped sideways, just avoiding her palm. One of his hands held Tang Yaoyao's wrist, and the other hand pressed on her chest. If it was a life and death fight now, Tang Yajing would already be a dead Yajing. Unfortunately, it is not. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 88. Swords and knives have no eyes, fists and feet are merciless. Because of this, when taking the exam for the top martial arts candidate, the martial arts candidates must sign a life and death agreement in advance. If an accident occurs during the competition, the consequences will be borne by themselves. Tang Ning regretted a little. Why didn't he sign a contract with Tang Yaoyao just now? If he touched a place on her body that he shouldn't touch during the competition, he would not have to bear any consequences. However, it was too late to say anything now. He attacked her breasts, attacked Tang Yajing's breasts. If she had breasts, it would be fine, but the key is that she didn't have breasts. Wouldn't he be charged with the crime of attacking her breasts in vain? No, Tang Ning could feel it, there were still breasts. He didn't dare to feel it anymore, and quickly took his hand back, saying, "Accident, accident, why didn't you dodge just now?" Tang Yaoyao wanted to dodge, but at that moment, after he dodged her palm, he grabbed her wrist. Without using his internal force, he had two legs and one hand, so she had nowhere to hide. There was no time to react at all. Because of extreme embarrassment, her breathing was a little rapid, and her face began to turn red. Tang Ning was keenly aware of this, and before she reached the limit of anger, she turned around without hesitation and strode out of the yard. "I have something to do with Xiaoai, so I'm leaving first." He couldn't even beat Tang Yajing with one hand, let alone Tang Yajing who was running wild with full blood. Of the 36 strategies, running away is the best strategy. If he stayed in the yard, he would die. Tang Yaoyao stood in the yard, stunned for a long time, lowered her head and looked at her chest, and a trace of embarrassment appeared on her face again. She stomped her feet violently, and a piece of blue brick under her feet broke into several pieces. Zhonggai's room. Zhonggai finished reading Tang Ning's strategy paper and said, "I have marked all the grammatical errors for you and corrected them. Take a look first. If there is anything you don't understand, we can talk about it later." Tang Ning stared blankly at the front, a little absent-minded. Seeing him like this, Zhongyi stretched out her hand, waved it in front of his eyes, and asked, "What are you thinking about?" Tang Ning came back to her senses, looked at her and asked, "Did anyone bully you and Yao Yao when you were young?" Zhongyi looked at him and asked in confusion, "Why are you asking all of a sudden?" Tang Ning thought for a moment and said, "Curious." Zhongyi thought for a moment and said, "In the beginning, there was. What happened later?" "Later, some people had their teeth knocked out by Yao Yao, some had their heads broken by her, and some had their ribs broken by her." Zhongyi thought for a moment and said, "Since then, no one has bullied us." Tang Ning showed a forced smile on his face, so she was so powerful when she was a child. Zhongyi looked at him in confusion and asked, "What's wrong with you?" "Nothing." Tang Ning shook his head, picked up the revised policy paper, and said, "I'll take it back and take a look, and come to see you in the evening." He walked out of Zhongyi's room, sent Qing'er to check first, and confirmed again and again that there was no one in his yard, then ran back to his room quickly, closed the doors and windows, and then heaved a sigh of relief and felt relieved. When she was a child, she beat out the teeth and broke the ribs of those who bullied her and Zhongyi. How would she treat those who took advantage of her when she grew up? Cut off his hand? Or is there such a possibility that Tang Yajing once swore that for the man who took advantage of her, she would either kill him or marry him? She should not kill herself, so would she marry him? This possibility cannot be ruled out. Tang Ning sighed. If he was given another chance to start over, he would have simply admitted defeat. but it was strange that he could come up with that trick just now and turn defeat into victory. It was completely a flash of inspiration. Does this mean that he actually has the talent to become a martial arts master? He sat at the table and carefully recalled the scene just now. When pouring water, he found that the table was a little shaky. It should be that the books were not properly padded. Tang Ning leaned down, readjusted it, and continued to think on the table. Through his victory over Tang Yejing, it should be proved that he still has the talent for martial arts, and he is not as bad as Tang Yejing said. Tang Ning hadn't seen Tang Yao Yao for 2 days, but he met Li Tianlan again. The arrival of the Chu envoys in Lingzhou was naturally the top priority encountered by the Lingzhou government since the end of the state examination. Since ancient times, even if the relationship between two countries is bad, they will show a very good attitude towards the envoys of the enemy country. Without courtesy, there is no foundation. This is the etiquette that a great country must have. Not to mention that Chu and Chen have been friendly neighbors for many years. In Lingzhou, when facing the Chu envoys, the local officials of Lingzhou must show enough hospitality. Although they also hope that the Chu envoys will leave quickly, as long as they stay in Lingzhou for 1 day, they will treat them well. So when the envoy named Li Lan visited the Zhong mansion, Zhong Mingli, as the magistrate of Yong'an County, had to put aside the affairs of the government office and accompany him throughout the whole process. At the gate of the county government office, Li Tianlan looked at Zhong Mingli and said, "Mr. Zhong is busy with affairs, so don't worry about me anymore." Although there are indeed many things accumulated in the county government office, they are all miscellaneous matters. The Chu envoy specifically asked him to accompany him, which is his most important official business at this stage. Zhong Mingli shook his head and said, "It doesn't matter. There are not many affairs in the government office. Mr. Li is not familiar with Lingzhou, and I just don't have anything to do." "Isn't there Tang Jiwen?" Li Tianlan turned his head and looked at Tang Ning, who came out of Zhong's house, and said, "I'm sorry to delay Master Zhong, why don't I let Tang Jiwen accompany me around?" Zhong Mingli looked at her with a surprised look, and after a moment he looked at Tang Ning, waved his hand, and said, "Ning come here." Tang Ning knew that this little Master Li would not give up, and actually used a roundabout way to save the country. After a long round, he still troubled him. He no longer had to doubt the other party's intentions. Even a fool could see that she must have some intentions towards him. This made Tang Ning very embarrassed. The other party was an envoy from the state of Chu. Although the state of Chu and the state of Chen were brother states, brothers still had to settle accounts, not to mention brothers with different surnames. And she was a woman, at most they were brothers and sisters, or sisters and brothers. From the perspective of family and country, he shouldn't get too close to her. Not only that, although she was exposed as a man, Tang Yao Yao's Honggai and Su'er knew that she was a woman. As a married man, he had to keep his distance from her for the sake of chastity. Tang Ning looked at him and asked, "Where do you want to go, Brother Li?" Since his father-in-law had given him the task of being a tour guide, Tang Ning had to pretend to be more or less. Li Tianlan said casually, "Just walk around. I'll just follow Tang Jiwen wherever he goes. I'm going to have breakfast." Tang Ning walked towards his uncle's breakfast shop. Although he had already had breakfast at the Zhong mansion, he was hungry again after a strenuous exercise. Li Tianlan smiled and said, "I was in a hurry to get out today and didn't have time to have breakfast. It's just right for us to go together." Uncle San and Aunt San picked 2 girls from Sujia village to help them. The 2 girls were diligent and cleaned the shop spotlessly. "Uncle San, give me a bowl of tofu pudding." Tang Ning sat in the shop and said to his uncle, who was busy in the back room. He looked at Li Tianlan and asked, "What would you like to eat, Brother Li?" Li Tianlan thought for a moment and said, "Same as Tang Jiwen, a bowl of tofu pudding." Tang Ning asked again, "Brother Li, do you like sweet or salty food?" Li Tianlan thought for a moment and said, "Sweet." Tang Ning waved to a little girl and said, "Jiao 2 bowls of tofu pudding, 1 sweet and 1 salty, and a tray of buns." "Okay, brother." Ning Jiao went to prepare it with a smile. Li Tianlan sat down opposite Tang Ning, looked at him, and asked, "The provincial exam will be held in a few months. When will Tang Jiwen go to Beijing?" "Wait until February next year." Li Tianlan thought for a moment and said, "I didn't get to see Tang Jiwen in this provincial exam. I won't miss him next February." Tang Ning looked at her in surprise and asked, "You haven't gone back in February next year?" Li Tianlan looked at him for a long time and asked, "Have I offended Tang Jiwen in any way?" Tang Ning shook his head. He was broad-minded. He didn't care at all about her annoying him at the Lumming banquet. The last time he and Tang Yao Yao were disgusted with each other and vomited all over, she wanted to lend a hand. What's more, Tang Yao Yao had longer legs than her, and she was more majestic than Tang Yao Yao. Although they both had shortcomings, they were both the type Tang Ning liked. However, whether from the perspective of the great cause of the country or the small cause of the family, he couldn't be too close to Miss Li. Li Tianlan looked at him and asked, "Since you haven't offended Tang Jiwen, why is Tang Jiwen so distant?" Tang Ning wanted to keep a distance from her, but it was a bit embarrassing to be pointed out to her face. Jiao put 2 bowls of tofu pudding on the table and said with a smile, "Brother Xiaoning, the tofu pudding is here." Tang Ning looked at the 2 bowls of tofu pudding on the table, looked at Li Tianlan again, sighed, and said, "Because you like sweet tofu pudding, I like salty. Since ancient times, sweet and salty cannot coexist, and people with different paths cannot make plans together." For the fastest update of error-free novel reading, please visit and bookmark this site to read the latest novels. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 89. Ruyi Xiaolang Jun Text Volume 89 3-day deadline. Tofu pudding is sweet or salty. This matter is of great importance. For this, I will die for justice. I will not hesitate. Miss Li could not imagine what kind of confrontation the sweet party and the salty party would have hundreds of years later because of the taste of tofu pudding. Li Tianlan took a bite of sweet tofu pudding, and then looked at Tang Ning calmly. Obviously, Tang Ning's reason just now could not convince her. Tofu is tasteless, sweet and salty are chosen by oneself. Tang Ning shook his head and said, "It's just a joke, don't worry about it. You and I have no grudges. How can I refuse you for no reason? I will treat you today. Miss Li can eat 3 bowls." Although it was Tang Ning who treated him, Uncle San would definitely not accept his money. In this way, if Li Tianlan ate more than 3 bowls, he would feel distressed, and when he felt distressed, he would definitely nag Tang Ning in his ear. Li Tianlan did not continue to dwell on it and changed the subject. "I have heard about the difficulty of the state examination in Chen State. The first round brought together more than 10 subjects and allowed the candidates to decide for themselves. This was the first of its kind in all countries. Since the founding of Chen State, there has only been one case of someone who could answer all the questions correctly. Tang Jiwen was so young and yet he was able to do this. Such talent is really admirable." "It's not a talent." Tang Ning smiled modestly and said, "I just spent the time that others spend drinking tea studying." Tang Jiwen is still as modest as ever. The first round of the state examination, it is true that you can be ranked first through hard work, but hard work alone is not enough for the second and third rounds. Li Tianlan looked at him and said, "Especially the third round of policy essays, which involves water control, epidemic prevention, reason, and law. It is rare for ordinary people to answer one question well, but Tang Jiwen can attract praise from 3 assistant examiners at the same time. Among more than 1,000 examens, only you can do it." Tang Ning realized at this time that Miss Li was more than a little better than Tang Yao Yao. Tang Yejing never spoke like this. She would not praise her hard work, nor would she admit her talent. She would only doubt his endurance. He looked at Li Tianlan and said politely, "Brother Li was the top scholar at the age of 17. Who else can be called a great man in front of you? Be polite. When others praise you, the best way is not to be modest, but to immediately come up with a wave of commercial praise." In addition, he was somewhat suspicious of Li Tianlan's identity. Whether it was Chen or Chu, women were not allowed to participate in the imperial examinations. It was incredible that she could become the top scholar of Chu as a girl. Could there be any shady dealings or behind-the-scenes manipulation? Li Tianlan looked at him and said, "That's not as knowledgeable as Tang Jiwen, who is proficient in water management, medicine, law, and solving cases." Tang Ning smiled and said, "He is not as knowledgeable as you say. In fact, he only knows a little bit." Tang Jiwen is modest again. Li Tianlan shook his head and said, "When we first came to Lingzhou, we heard that Tang Jiwen was very smart and solved many strange cases. Are these all rumors? Although it's not a rumor, it's a bit exaggerated. I really don't understand things like solving cases." Tang Ning had finished eating tofu pudding. He still hadn't figured out Miss Li's routine. She spent so much effort, arranging a chance encounter, and saving the country in a roundabout way. Was it just to brag about herself? But one thing is for sure, that is, he must not follow her words, otherwise he will be surrounded by 500 ducks, which he has experienced deeply. After breakfast, Tang Ning accompanied her to walk on the street. There was nothing to do, so he just took it as a way to digest the food. When walking on the street, if you meet the right person at the right time, time will pass very quickly. If you meet the wrong person, every step you take will feel like torture. Tang Ning and Li Tianlan walked, and unknowingly arrived at the post house where the Chu envoy stayed. "I will take Brother Li here." Tang Ning looked at her and smiled, "See you another day." Li Tianlan looked at his back as he left. After a moment, a smile appeared on the corner of his mouth, and he whispered, "Did you do it on purpose?" The middle-aged envoy of Chu came over from a distance, looked at her, and asked, "Sir, did you get his words?" Li Tianlan shook his head. The middle-aged envoy pondered for a moment and said, "As long as we closely monitor the movements of the water department, we will know what strategy he has offered to the Chen court. The Chen state has been suffering from floods in Xinjiang for a long time, and there will be action soon." He paused halfway through his words, looked at Li Tianlan, and said, "But this will take time. Why don't we just send Tang Ning?" Li Tianlan waved his hand, interrupted him, and said, "No need, I have my own ideas on this matter." Seeing that she had already spoken, the middle-aged envoy said no more. He bowed to Li Tianlan, and when he walked towards the post house, he subconsciously touched his waist. He suddenly stopped, looked at his waist, and touched around in disbelief. The next moment, he stood there in a daze, and his face immediately turned pale. Li Tianlan looked at him and asked in confusion, "What happened?" The middle-aged envoy's face had turned panicky, and he said in a trembling voice, the seal is lost." The Lingzhou post house became a panic, and when the chaos was in turmoil, Tang Ning had already returned home. Zhou Mingli saw him and asked in surprise, "Where is Lord Li?" Tang Ning raised his head and said, "Send him back to the post house." Zhou Mingli was even more surprised, "So fast, what did you do?" "I treated him to a bowl of tofu bread, took him for a walk, and then sent him back." Tang Ning told the truth. Zhou Mingli glanced at him suspiciously, but didn't ask any more questions. Tang Ning walked towards his yard. How could he have time to take a walk with Miss Li? Miss Tang's matter had not been resolved yet. If this matter is not resolved for a day, he will not be able to let go. He does not want to lose a few teeth or break a few ribs for no reason. The problem was that Fairy Tang had deliberately not seen him these past few days, leaving him no chance to apologize. He came to the base of the wall and stood on a big stone, intending to explore the enemy's situation first. He stuck his head out and looked towards Tang Yao Yao's yard, and saw her stepping on the stones and climbing up the yard wall. The two pairs of eyes looked at each other. Peeping is a very shameful thing, but what is even more shameful is that the other person is also peeping, and the two people see each other. Tang Ning could feel Tang Yao Yao's breath on his face, and the atmosphere gradually became more embarrassing. "I'm sorry," he was the first to break the awkwardness. Tang Ning looked at her sincerely and said, "I didn't do it on purpose that day." Tang Yao Yao's expression was stunned for a moment, and then she became flustered. When she heard Tang Ning talk about that incident, her face even turned red. She jumped off the stone, jumped up the courtyard wall from another place, and landed in Tang Ning's courtyard. She waved her hands generously and said, "Fists and feet have no eyes. People who practice martial arts do not stick to trivial matters." When she said this, Tang Ning felt even more uneasy. This is not Fairy Tang. If she doesn't listen to his explanation and directly fights with him, he might feel more at ease. She cracked her knuckles and said, "Come on, let me see if you have made any progress in the past 2 days." Tang Ning shook her head. Tang Yao Yao waved his hand and said, "It's okay, I'll let you go just like I did that day." Tang Ning continued to shake her head. It was not up to her whether to give in or not. She just wanted to find an opportunity to avenge the attack on her chest. Tang Ning was not stupid. He would just practice on his own from now on, without the help of Fairy Tang. Tang Yao Yao glanced at him with disdain, looked at him, and asked, "Where did you learn that move?" Tang Ning asked in confusion, "Which move?" Fairy Tang glanced at him with a slightly unkind look. Tang Ning thought for a moment and immediately said, "I don't know about that move you mentioned. I suddenly used it at that time." He looked at Tang Yao Yao and asked, "Do you think this is a move I created myself because of my extraordinary talent?" Tang Yao Yao looked at him and twitched her lips, "Ha ha." Tang Ning can understand that Tang Yao Yao may not be able to accept the fact that her talent is better than hers. This is human nature and understandable. In any case, she seemed not to worry about what happened last time, and Tang Ning felt relieved a little. He went back to his room and started doing today's policy practice. He wanted to write it as soon as possible, and then go to Zhong Yi's room in the evening to ask her to help him correct his grammar. When he sat at the table and wrote the first word, Zhao Zhija, the county magistrate of Yian County, frowned. The envoy of Chu State lost money within his jurisdiction. If it was just the silver that was lost, it would be okay, but according to the envoy, in addition to the silver, he also lost an extremely important thing, and nothing could go wrong with that thing. There is no small matter for an envoy. Governor Dong has given him a death order and the case must be solved within 3 days. Zhao Zhija knew the importance of this matter. If the case could not be solved, not to mention a small magistrate of Njian, even Dong governor himself would be responsible. He stood up, looked at a policeman beside him, and said in a deep voice, "Bring all the habitual thieves in that area back to the county government office." "Yes, sir." The policeman responded, and when he exited, he sighed. The county government receives cases of theft almost every few days, but less than 1 out of 10 is successfully solved. This time, the envoy of the Chu state lost something, and his master was in big trouble. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 90. The 90th chapter of the main text of Ruyi Xiaolang Jun, You Wait. The dispute between the sweet and salty tofu pudding parties is a joke to Fang Xiaopang. This morning, she ate a bowl of sweet tofu pudding, a bowl of salty tofu pudding, and a tray of buns. If Tang Ning hadn't stopped her, she would have wanted to try the taste of mixing sweet and salty tofu pudding with some vinegar. The breakfast shop's business has declined in the past 2 days because another major case happened in Lingzhou City. The impact of the case was huge. Almost all of Lingzhou was mobilized. The constables and runners of the governor's mansion, Yian County office, and Yong'an County office were all dispatched, causing panic in the city. The commotion was so big, but in fact, the case itself was just a small theft case. The person who was robbed was an envoy of the state of Chu. He was robbed on the street in Lingzhou. In addition to losing silver, he also lost a very important thing. Tang Ning didn't know what the Chu envoy had lost, but he knew it was very important, otherwise the Lingzhou governor wouldn't be so impatient and give a 3-day deadline to solve the case. If someone else had lost something, the local government could slowly investigate, and if they couldn't find out, the case would be left unsolved after a long time. But the person who lost the thing was the Chu envoy, and the Chu envoy's things were stolen on the territory of Chen State, which was a loss of face for Chen State. If there was any diplomatic dispute because of this, the severity of the matter would be beyond the reach of even the Lingzhou governor. This was bad news, but there was also good news. The good news was that the Chu envoy lost the things on the territory of Yian County, and the one who was ordered by Governor Dong to solve the case within 3 days was Yian County Magistrate Zhao Zhizhe, not Yong'an County Magistrate Zhong Mingli. There was nothing to worry about. Tang Ning was not idle enough to worry about other people's things. There was still half a year before the provincial examination, and the time seemed to be sufficient, but excluding the time spent on the road and various miscellaneous matters, there was not much time left for him. In the past 2 days, the police and yamen runners were dispatched in large numbers. The people in Lingzhou city were in a panic. The ones who were more panicked than them were the ruffians and habitual thieves in the city. All the habitual thieves with criminal records in the yamen were arrested and taken to the Yian County yamen. A policeman walked in quickly from outside, looked at Zhao Zhizhe, and said, "Sir, they have also been ruled out. When the envoy lost something, they were not on that street. There are witnesses who can testify." Zhao Zhizhe picked up a pen and crossed out 2 names on a piece of paper in front of him. He counted and said, "There are 5 left." As soon as he finished speaking, someone else came in from outside and said, "Sir, it has been found that the other 2 were not present." Zhao Zhizhe crossed out the first 2 names again and looked at the last 3 people left. The constable looked at him and said, "Sir, these 3 are brothers. They are often arrested for stealing things, but they all insist that they did not steal the envoy's things." Which thief would admit that he stole things? A man who looked like a constable snorted coldly and said, "Take all the 18 kinds of torture and I don't believe they won't confess." Zhao Zhizhe looked at him and frowned slightly. This person was sent by Governor Dong from the governor's office to help him solve the case. Even he couldn't be too negligent. He relaxed his brows and said, "Captain Jiu's move is inappropriate. Several Chu envoys are outside. If they are tortured, they will be laughed at. It's good to find the envoy's lost things. If they are not found, the Lingzhou government abuses torture and tortures them into confessing, and the whole country will know about it. The court has made up its mind to punish cruel officials since a year ago. It has made clear regulations on the implementation of punishments. It is not allowed to use torture without evidence." Another constable came up to him and whispered, "Sir, this case is of great importance and is a special case. As long as you don't use those tortures, the higher UPS won't blame you." Zhao Zhizhe looked outside, pondered in his heart, and nodded, "Use torture." Captain Jiu nodded and said, "It should have been done long ago." The constable responded and withdrew. Several people waited patiently in the hall. "How is the case going?" Just then, a voice came from outside. Zhao Zhizhe looked at Zhong Mingli who came in from outside, and said lightly, "It will be solved soon, don't worry about it, Lord Zhong." As soon as he finished speaking, the constable who had just left came in from outside, with a somewhat ugly face, looking at Zhao Zhizhe, shaking his head and said, "Sir, they still have no confession, is it really not them who did it?" The constable's face was still a little worried. The people they caught were all well-known habitual thieves in the city, but it only meant that they were more likely to commit crimes than ordinary people, but they were not necessarily them. If the last three people were not, the case would immediately fall into a deadlock. There was only 1 day left before the 3-day deadline of Governor Dong. After 1 day, even if Governor Dong did not blame, the envoy of Chu would not let it go, and there was a great possibility that he would report the case. Zhou Mingli ignored Zhao's hijab and looked at the constable, asking, "How far have you investigated this case? Tell the truth." "Yes, Mr. Zhou." The constable looked at him, nodded immediately, and said, "We have checked all the habitual thieves in the city." The county jail. In a cell, 3 people leaned against the wall, their faces extremely pale. One wiped the cold sweat from his forehead, looked around, looked at the man next to him, and whispered, "Brother, what should we do?" The man gritted his teeth and said in a low voice, "If you want to live, remember this. This case has nothing to do with us. We didn't do it." The 2 men showed extremely regretful expressions on their faces and nodded with difficulty. If they knew that the man was an envoy of the state of Chu and stole his things, the government would turn the whole Lingzhou upside down. They would never do that job. But it's too late to say anything now. If they don't confess, it's fine. Once they confess, they don't know how the government will deal with them. Compared with losing their heads, what is a little bit of physical pain? In the county government, Zhou Mingli had listened to the description of the constable and understood the progress of the case. In the end, there were only 3 suspects left, and these 3 people were not necessarily the real criminals. If this case was in his hands, the current situation would not be much better than Zhao's hijab. There is only 1 day left before the 3-day deadline. If the case cannot be solved by this time tomorrow, the local government of Lingzhou will not be able to cover this matter. Zhou Mingli looked at him and asked, "There's still 1 day left. Can you make it?" Zhao's hijab glanced at him and said, "If you're here to watch the fun, go back to where you came from." Zhou Mingli glanced at him indifferently and turned to walk out. When he reached the door, he paused, but didn't look back. He whispered, "Wait." During lunch, Tang Ning found that his father-in-law was a little strange. He wanted to say something several times but didn't say anything. He felt a little strange. Nothing big happened in Yong'an County government these days, and he didn't need to worry about anything. Since the Lumming feast, Governor Dong has also been much quieter. Not only did he not embarrass him, but he showed goodwill many times. With everything going smoothly, what else could make him so entangled? Ning-er. Zhou Mingli had put down his chopsticks, looked at him, and said, "There is a case that needs your help." Tang Ning thought that his father-in-law had encountered another case, but he didn't expect that he was talking about the theft of the Chu envoy. The person directly responsible for this case should be Zhao's hijab, the magistrate of Yian County. It doesn't matter if the case cannot be solved. It's better to let a friend die than to let me die. I don't know why my father-in-law asked him for help. But since he had already asked, Tang Ning couldn't refuse. Without hesitation, he nodded and agreed. After all, there were no outsiders here. He didn't need to be modest or perfunctory like Li Tianlan. He was familiar with various detective dramas, and some of the ancient and modern interrogation methods he knew were indeed more scientific and advanced. After lunch, he accompanied his father-in-law to the Yian County government. As soon as he entered the county government, he saw Li Tianlan standing in the yard. Li Tianlan looked at him and asked, "What is Tang Jiwen doing here?" Tang Ning thought for a while and said, "Just strolling around."